Lords of Waterdeep, the game that sent me into the board game rabbit hole and gave me uncontrollable splurging habits. Despite being released in 2012, it still manages to compete or even beat Google search results of other recent Flavor of the Month games, which is pretty impressive. If you're looking for a modern board game to get into to see what the hobby is all about, or just trying to find a good worker placement game, well, look no further my friend, because you have found one of the best games in the hobby. Similar to a lot of board games, in Lords of Waterdeep, you'll win if you have got the most points at the end of the game. There are two main ways in which you can obtain points. One is from your quest cards, and the other one is from your Lord cards. Quest cards require some resources for you to complete. For example, this particular one here says that it requires 2 orange, 1 black, and 2 purple cubes. When you complete it, it will give you 11 points and 4 gold coins. Think of these quests as a recipe of a dish that you need to make in a restaurant. Those cubes are your ingredients, which will be consumed to make the dish. You'll then get paid with points and money after you fulfill the order. The quest rewards are actually quite variative, as they might also give you more cubes or resources, and also these intrigue cards, which I'll explain in a bit, and even some unique rewards like getting an extra turn. There's also this special type of quest called plot quest. They give you less immediate rewards upon completion, but they will always grant you a permanent passive benefit. So after you complete this particular one, all warfare quests you complete from then on will give you extra 2 points. The quest cards in the game will always fall into one of the 5 categories, which are piety, warfare, skullduggery, commerce, and arcana. The classification is important, especially when it comes to these Lord cards. Before the game starts, you'll be given a few intrigues, quest cards, workers, and finally a Lord card. The Lord cards are basically secret objectives that will score you extra points at the very end of the game. For example, this guy right here scores you 4 points for each piety and each warfare quest that you completed. So you would want to focus on doing the quests that your Lord corresponds to. Okay, so you know how to get points from quests and Lord cards by spending some resources. But how do you exactly obtain those resources? Well, that's where your workers come into play. You'll be putting them on the empty worker spots on the main board. You'll see that those worker spots are concentrated around the middle area of the board. On your turn, there is only one main thing that you can do, and that is to place a worker. You'll then have to decide where you want to place that worker, as each spot gives you different things. The spots basically show you what you'll get. For example, the black staff tower here simply gives you 1 purple cube. And by knowing that, all these other basic worker spots are very self-explanatory. Aside from basic resources, you could also get more quest cards from these spots. You don't exactly draw a random card when you get more of them. Instead, for the first 2 spots, you get to choose one out of the 4 displayed quest cards on the board. Then, another quest card is drawn to refill the empty spot. You will also get a few extra resources depending on which spot you place the worker on. Alternatively, if you don't like the available 4, you could go to the 3rd spot to instead scrap all 4 currently shown cards and choose one from the 4 new ones. But enough of these mundane spots, and I hope you are ready for the most interesting spot in this game, the Builder's Hall. The Builder's Hall allows you to spend some money to buy a building. The price depends on which building you are going to buy. Upon purchase, you'll then place it on one of the empty building spots. Buildings in this game are basically just another worker spot available on the board, but it always belongs to a player. If the owners go to their own building, then it's basically just a normal worker spot. But if anyone else were to use it, the owner will gain a bonus listed on the building. And each building has their own bonuses. So it's good to invest on these buildings, as you can rake in free resources when it's not your turn. Now that I think about it, this is kinda similar to another game I know. Oh god, never mind. Remember those intrigue cards? Well, you can play one of them from your hand when you place a worker on the Waterdeep harbor. These intrigue cards allow you to do various things, like simply giving you and possibly other players some resources, or taking them away from either one person or everyone. It could also do some rule bending stuff, like using an unavailable spot, or even use one of the unsold buildings in the Builder's Hall. And finally, we have the mandatory quest intrigue cards, which we'll definitely talk about later. The extra cool thing about this spot though, aside from being able to fit 3 workers, is that once everyone is done placing all their workers, any workers occupying this spot could then be placed again somewhere else. Yep, so you get to play an intrigue card and use another empty spot. There will be fewer choices for the second placement though, because you're basically getting the leftover spots. And last but not least, we have Castle Waterdeep. Going here gives you an intrigue card and the first player marker. The first player marker simply lets you go first whenever a new round starts. Why would you want to go first exactly? Well, for starters, the game doesn't automatically rotate the first player marker, meaning you'll never be the first player unless you actively choose to be. And since a spot can only fit 1 worker, you might wanna get it if you desperately need a resource, or say a really good quest or building has shown up and you really wanna get it, or maybe you just want to secure a place in the Waterdeep harbor to play an intrigue card. And that's all the worker spaces on the main board. If you notice, there isn't really a space for completing a quest. Well, that's because after you place a worker and get whatever, you also have the option to complete 1 quest before finally ending your turn. So there isn't really like a dedicated spot for it because it's a part of your turn. It's 1 quest per worker and not per round. A lot of people seem to get this the other way around for some reason. And yeah, place workers until no one can anymore, then reassign the ones in Waterdeep Harbor somewhere else. Then everyone retrieves back their workers to start a new round, and place them all over again. There's a total of 8 rounds in the game, and at the start of round 5, everyone will get an extra permanent worker. So yeah, that's basically all the rules to play this game. So what's good about this one? For starters, the game is very straightforward. Everything in the game makes sense, and there are no convoluted mechanisms with millions of conditions to fulfill it. Like, I imagine if the game were to come out today, the quest rewards would depend on how far up you are in 3 of the game's tracks, multiplied by pi if today's date is a prime number. A bit hyperbolic there, but you know what I'm saying. I'm not saying that those more complex games are bad. I suppose they just make me appreciate this game's simplicity. Up next, as you can see from this very scientific graph, there is barely a learning curve in this game, which I believe allows people that have never played the game before to compete with the ones who have. It's really accessible, but not way too simple, making it a great gateway game, perhaps the best one there is. The game's player interaction from the intrigues and buildings is also pretty decent. Granted, it isn't as great as games like Dune Imperium. Also, the mechanism where you reassign the workers in Waterdeep Harbor is brilliant. It seems they knew that the intrigue cards cannot be too powerful because they are random, so they make it weaker, but compensated it by letting you reassign your workers. Big brain design, really. And then we have the buildings. Gosh, I love them so much. They progressively expand the game as they introduce new worker spots that are likely gonna be different every game. And on top of that, the ownership part of it always gives positive interactions, because it's always a win-win kind of trade. Some newer games have taken notes out of this game's design, but they seem to always leave out the building part, which makes me sad. Sure, there are games that have the ownership/building mechanism as well, but what makes this game have an edge over some of them is its variety. Every quest and building in this game is unique. Even each building in the game has their own ownership rewards. The intrigue cards also vary, though they do duplicate some of the cards. Okay, onto the things I don't really like about the game. The theme is basically non-existent. The cubes are supposed to be rogues, warriors, clerics, and mages, but they might as well just be food ingredients like the cooking analogy I described before. Everyone will call them cubes, regardless of what you say they are. There are these replacement meeples you can get online on Etsy, but they cost around half the price of the actual game itself. Do they think anyone would actually buy it? No. I wouldn't have the slightest idea why anyone would want it. It's not like they're really cute or have different meeple designs for each color or anything. But seriously, be careful going there because you'll want everything! And finally, the absolute worst thing about this game, the mandatory quest intrigue cards. When you play one, you give that card to someone else instead. It's basically a quest card with a slightly different anatomy to it. But the damning thing about it is, it locks out all your other unfinished quests until you finish that particular one. It also gives extremely underwhelming rewards and doesn't count towards your Lord card bonus. Oh my god, I don't even know where to begin with how awful these are. This materialization of pain, suffering, and agony is probably supposed to be quote-unquote catch-up mechanism, but man, do they feel like a massive oversight. Due to the hidden Lord cards, everyone's total points are unknown, so you're mostly just guessing who the leader is, which is horrible because it can also potentially set back someone massively. Take this one for example. If the right building doesn't show up or you don't have the right intrigue cards, you might need to use 3 workers just to get rid of that crap, and depending on the player count, that might just be one whole round. How is that even fair? Having to give these cards to someone is also a bit of a waste, because you basically use a turn to do nothing for yourself. Plus, it might trigger a feedback loop where the two of you just starts dragging each other down. The real winners here are the people that's just watching on the sidelines. Oh, and guess what? There's nothing in the game that prevents you from having 2 at the same time. Yep, just imagine that. There's 6 of these abominations in the 50 card intrigue deck, but that's 6 cards too many, because these things are some actual bullshit. How to fix it? Remove those cards from the game. No, seriously. Those mandatory quest cards do not affect anything else in the game. The only time it's been mentioned is in this literally one intrigue card, where they allow you to get rid of one mandatory quest card for some points. But that card also works on normal quest cards anyway, so it's still pretty useful. Trust me, you'll save your friendship and the game is gonna feel so much better without those cards. I have been playing the game without them for so long, so I guess you could say that this house rule is mandatory for me. Or if you would like a more permanent, or should I say legacy solution, this would also work. By the way, I found that the BGG community is surprisingly rather divided when it comes to removing these cards. There are multiple page threads discussing this exact house rule. I think everyone should definitely try playing with and without, but just be aware that this card is one of those things that makes people not wanna play the game the second time. Anyways, that's all there is to this game. It's a great game. Tell that to your friends, and maybe your mom and dad too, I don't know. Before we move on and compare this game to these other 2 very strikingly similar more recent games, I wanna just real briefly talk about the expansion Scoundrels of Skullport. There are 2 modules modules in this expansion. The Undermountain module's quest cards can reward you up to a maximum of 40 points, compared to the base game's maximum of 25. The new cards and buildings from this module allows you to put resources onto a worker spot. If someone goes there, they will get that resource on top of whatever that spot gives them. There is also an extra board with 3 new worker spaces, which are self-explanatory. Overall, more variety of the same thing, which is great, but the juicier part is the Skullport module. It adds a corruption mechanic, which are these blue skulls that you can obtain from this corruption board. Whenever you have to get a skull, you always take the closest skull to this -1 space. When the game ends, look at the corruption board and ignore the non-empty spaces. The most negative number you can see is the negative points that each skull carries. So, if you have 3 skulls by the end of this game, you'll get -15 points from them in total. Well, why would you ever wanna get them then? The module gives you very rewarding quests, worker spots, and entry cards. But they always make you take a skull or two. The game basically provides you with a faster but riskier way to get resources. You will want to return those skulls before the game ends so you won't get penalized. The trouble is, there is just not as many reliable ways to return them, so you'll have to strive for it, especially in the later rounds. The mechanic also has a seesawing effect. If not many people go corrupt, then there's even more incentive to do so because there's going to be less skulls taken from the track, meaning there's less penalty for each skull. But if too many people go corrupt, then you would want to go to the cleaner side because the points penalty becomes more dire per skull. Plus, the game provides occasional ways for the cleaner players to screw the more corrupt ones. And lastly, the module also lets you put those skulls onto the worker spots. This is no joke, the best expansion I've ever gotten and probably the only one I will ever talk about. It adds an interesting mechanic and even more variety to the game. The integration is seamless and you only do the fiddly bits like taking cards out just once. So there's very little extra preparation every session. You'll wanna play with the 2 modules and never look back. This is easily a 10 out of 10 expansion for me, and that's coming from someone who usually dislikes expansions. It does add some more mandatory quests and cards related to that, but you already know where I'll tell you to put them. Okay, so comparison time. First, we have Champions of Midgard, which I'll refer to as COM from now on. In Waterdeep, you use workers to get cubes and quest cards to turn them into points and win the game. In COM, you also use workers, but this time to get these dice to fight monsters for points to win the game. You roll the dice you assign to fight the monster. You are looking to get single or double strikes to do some damage, but occasionally you might also get shields or at worst blanks. If you at least rolled as much strikes as the enemy's health, then you have defeated the enemy. However, you will also take some damage equal to the enemy's power, in this case 3. Luckily, each shield negates a point in damage, so you only have to lose 2 dice instead of 3. If neither side was wiped out, then you go to a second round and reroll your remaining dice, and repeat until at least one side is completely defeated. If the monster is slain, you'll get points and some resources, plus all the dice that survives the combat. But if you fail to destroy it, well, you'll get absolutely nothing, which is one of the biggest complaints people have about the game. Luck. By knowing the faces of each individual die, we can tell that it's very likely to roll blanks. There are these rune cards which are similar to the intrigue cards in Waterdeep and reroll tokens that you can use to mitigate some luck, but there is nothing that gives you certain hits in the combat. You don't have to use a specific number of dice to fight monsters in COM though, so you can assign more dice to fight a monster just to be less risky, but you will end up using more resources for the same amount of points. Ultimately, you can be doing the best optimal strategies in the game and still lose due to a few bad rolls, and you roll a lot of dice in this game. Also, the game lacks variety, as many of the monster cards are repeated and each category always gives you the same things. There is also not much of a player interaction, as the game's equivalent of intrigue cards will mostly affect only the user. There's also the blame token mechanism where if no one kills the troll this round, everyone will get a blame token, which is more or less equivalent to the blue skulls. But if someone kills the troll, that person gets to give a blame token to someone else. Again, very minimum player interaction. Overall, a very thematic and thrilling game that is also quite aesthetically pleasing, but not much player interaction and the game gets quite samey after a while. Plus the luck aspect could leave a bad taste. So with all that, I personally think Lords of Waterdeep is still the better game. And lastly, we have Lockup. Lockup is a lot more similar to Waterdeep than COM. In the game, you use workers to get cubes to forge unique items with unique recipes, which will get you points and possibly other things to win the game. The major difference is, the worker spots are not limited to one person as everyone could compete for its rewards. The spots have multiple tiers of rewards, and your total worker strength compared to others will determine which one you'll get. Everyone has workers with 2 to 5 strength, plus the Enforcer and the Lookout. The Enforcer's strength is equal to the number of red cubes you have, while the Lookout has 0 strength. If your workers fail to get anything from a spot, they automatically go to this sad library spot instead, where you can get these cards, which are basically equivalent to Waterdeep's intrigue cards. There's also these goon cards, which gets introduced to each spot every round. Each type of goon gives you different ways of scoring, and you can pay to obtain them from this spot. They also sometimes bring suspicion cubes to whichever spot they are on. The player with the highest strength will also take the suspicion cubes on top of the spot's rewards. But if you have a lookout on that spot, the suspicion will be passed on to the next strongest player and so on. When the suspicion cubes from the supply is completely gone, a security raid will happen where the players with the most and second most suspicion cubes will lose some points. Lockup is what you get if you crank up Waterdeep's player interaction to the max. The area control-esque mechanic mechanic really shines and brings a lot of tension to the game. This is as good as Lords of Waterdeep, is what I would have said if the game's duration isn't so bloody long. A 5-player game, which I do not recommend, can easily go up to 2+ hours. And for a game this simple, it's really stretching it. The game allows you to, at max, place 2 out of 6 workers face down on the board. This is an interesting mechanic, sure, but it also generates a lot of wait time as people often try to figure out the hidden information. This game to me desperately needs some sort of simultaneous action mechanic. Sadly, the expansion that just concluded on Kickstarter not long ago didn't seem to address this. The game really has some potential, but for now, Waterdeep to me remains undefeated. So yeah, that's all for this video. It's a lot longer than I expected, but I hope you enjoyed it. See ya!